So if leaders in the United States are not passing their skill base down to your generation, they are making a grave mistake. Politicians at times work on the assumption that once the deal is done, societal healing automatically follows. And in reality, nothing could be further from the truth.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode on the Phoenix Generation podcast. Today's conversation is a powerful one. We're joined here by Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, a Methodist minister, psychologist, and internationally respected peacebuilder. His work is largely shaped by his lived experiences in Northern Ireland. Dr. Mason is the founder and director of Rethinking Conflict, an organization based in Belfast that is deeply committed to transforming communities globally as well. So, Dr. Mason, thank you so much for joining us today.
Nice to be with you in a warmer climate in Ireland at the moment in January, as you can imagine.
Naturally, I couldn't. But yes, so for our first question, for listeners who may be new to your work, how do you usually explain what you do when someone asks, so what is conflict transformation?
There's a number of ways of defining it, actually, Samantha. People talk about conflict management, conflict resolution, conflict transformation. In many ways, you could say managing it is managing the conflict so that there aren't too many casualties. The resolution would be the resolving the conflict. Transformation, really, by my definition, would be defining and changing the conditions that led to the conflict. So really it means the complete transformation of society. I'll quote a Mennonite, John Paul Lederach, a guy now in his late 60s, former professor at Notre Dame, currently living in Colorado. And John Paul Lederach has written extensively around that. So if some of your listeners and viewers are more interested in relation to that, if they Google John Paul Lederach Peacebuilding Pyramid, which really looks at this kind of escalating upwards, looking at a community level, a middle level, and a senior level. John Paul Lederach's theory is actually people like you and me are the most important because we're in the middle. Access to those at the top, access to those at the bottom. Because those at the bottom are never going to kind of jump straight to those at the top, but people in the middle are really, really crucial. So back home, we have this concept called the political peace process versus the social peace process. We wouldn't have a peace process without civic society. And that's not knocking what politicians did, but civic actors, the way I describe it, actually, Samantha, my phrase is, civic society is the social glue that holds our peace process together.
Wow. So could you get into the differences very briefly of what it looks like for the social rather than the political aspect?
If you were drilling into that in detail, politicians at times work on the assumption that once the deal is done, societal healing automatically follows. And in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. Most academics would say to you and me today that bedding down a peace process takes 50 years. So if you want to look at the Northern Irish peace process, we're sitting here today in 2026. We are 26 years into a peace process. And in reality, it's really your generation that are going to be the next runners of bedding down that peace process and making sure that the conditions that caused our conflict never reoccur. So civic society and that role are absolutely crucial. And if listeners are saying, well, hey, Gary, define civic society. Academics, journalists, business people, religious leaders, youth groups, those people that make up society. And I often illustrate that really from our own peace process. Good Friday Agreement was signed, Samantha, 1998, 10th of April, 1998. So your generation back home, you're described as a post-Good Friday baby. In other words, you were born after 1998. And a lot of my work is with that generation, which is absolutely crucial in continuing to bed down that actual peace process.
So you mentioned the next generation. And in accordance with Rethinking Conflict, you have the Emerging Young Leaders,
Yeah.
your cohort. Do you mind telling us a little bit more about your work with Rethinking Conflict and that next generation?
Yeah, interestingly, how it came about. So I established, I was in pastoral ministry, on the ground ministry, really for a 30-year block. And through a conversation with a colleague from London, he had suggested, look, Gary, between now, 20 years or so, do you retire? Which was about sort of 10 years ago or thereabouts. He's suggesting you need to give your skill base away. I think many people of my generation are too precious with their experiences rather than sharing the things they got right, mind you, and also the things they got wrong. I was having coffee in London with a senior British official, a few years older than me, but teasingly he said to me, Samantha, Gary, what are you doing for the next generation? And we were doing bits and pieces. No, but you need to be doing more. And really out of that conversation, July 2019, the Emerging Young Leaders concept was born. We've run about 70, Samantha, but the good story about that actually is it's now global. I do a lot of work in the Israeli-Palestinian theatre. My partner organisation in Jerusalem, Amal Tikva, which is both Israelis and Palestinians, Amal being the Arabic word for hope, Tikva, the Hebrew word for hope. So they have an Emerging Young Leaders programme, not in isolation. My Emerging Young Leaders are twinned with their Emerging Young Leaders. And the reason being, I don't need to remind listeners today, the Middle East ain't in a good space. And really a lot of the work we're trying to do is what I would define as engendering hope into a hopeless situation. Because as all your listeners know, and as you and I know, none of us can exist without hope. I mean, you're talking there about at university, your undergraduate work. You and I know if you fail your exams, you hope you get the resits. If you lose your job, you hope you get another job. If you're ill, you hope you get better. So how can we put some of that oxygen of hope, as I define it, into the Middle East? It doesn't stop there, because I'm sitting now, as you know, only too well, in Orlando, Florida, and the University of Central Florida have just launched literally this week their Emerging Young Leaders program. And I also do some work at Emory University and the Carter Center in Atlanta. Carter Center, 5 weeks ago, they launched their Emerging Young Leaders program. So it's really scaling up another generation and saying, no, you don't have to wait like you're in your 30s or 40s or 50s to be involved in this. You're part of society and your generation needs to take ownership of this.
100%. And many students like myself want to get engaged and involved in this work. And it's just amazing. And I think it's an indication of a cultural shift and a want to transform communities. Saying how your lessons in Northern Ireland have applied to the Middle East. You're taking these lessons and applying them to global contemporary situations. Rethinking Conflict takes lessons, including the US. So what parallels do you see between Northern Ireland and conflicts today, especially around identity and polarization in the United States?
Okay, invariably there, Samantha, where there's conflict, there's three components: land, identity, and religion. So it goes something like this. This land is my land, not your land. My identity is superior to your identity, and my religion is superior to your religion. I call that theologies of superiority. The sad thing is, in our space in the late 1960s, as you would know from some of your own research and undergraduate work, we had a civil rights movement that eventually spilled into civil unrest. And we spent 30 years killing each other. Now, the interesting thing, and I often say this to colleagues in the United States, and I say it unashamedly, when British troops first came into Northern Ireland in August 1969, common wisdom of the day was, this will be over by Christmas. Were they wrong? Our conflict didn't officially finish until 2005, even though the agreement was signed in 1998. So it was the longest, I often say, Samantha, the longest military operation in British history. And I don't need to remind you or our listeners, the Brits have fought a tremendous amount of wars. Once conflict begins, it's incredibly difficult to get it stopped. And I'm talking to colleagues in America, those who are people of faith, those who are people of goodwill, those are people who love this country, both Republicans and Democrats. I'm saying to them, even though you have your political differences, and we all do, because politics at times, by its very nature, can be adversarial, But I say categorically and unashamedly, do your utmost to make sure you never, never spill into a civil war. Why do I say that? I say this to American colleagues and friends. Don't be thinking this is the 1860s, your American Civil War of another generation. Because I say, Samantha, there's a very clear demarcation. North versus South. If you ever have a civil war, because of politics in this space at the moment, a civil war means someone in the next street wants to kill you because you're a Republican or Democrat. And what you'll end up with, sadly, will be a series of Belfasts all over the United States. And once conflict begins, it is incredibly difficult to bring to an end. 1974, we thought, maybe we're over the line. 1985, maybe we're over the line. And statistically, I think it's worthwhile viewers hearing these statistics. Northern Ireland today is about 2 million people, minuscule compared to the United States. But over that 30-year period, 69 to 1998, we had 47,000 injuries, 36,000 shootings, 30,000 people went through our penal system, 22,000 armed robberies, 16,000 bombings, and almost 4,000 deaths. Now, if I extrapolate those figures into the United States, so very simply put, if the Northern Irish conflict had have happened in the United States over a 30-year period, you would have had 9 million injuries, 8 million shootings, 7 million political prisoners, 5 million armed robberies, 4 million bombings, and almost 800,000 dead. So when I'm back home on the island of Ireland, not working in the Middle East or doing conversations here in the United States, my work is still dealing with the past. It's legacy. How we've scarred each other for all those generations. So even trauma, I'm sure some of your listeners, their backgrounds in psychology, trauma, social workers, medicine. Samantha, 1 in 5 ex-prisoners are drinking themselves to death. Even 28 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, we've the highest dosage of antidepressants in Western Europe and one of the highest in the world. So once it's over, the deal is done. It's the legacy that haunts you literally for generations.
Wow, those numbers, those are big
They're
numbers.
scary.
They're scary. They are. They are. And you mentioned that conflict passed well past the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. It still continued. So my question is, do you believe conflict is ever truly resolved, or is the goal learning how to live with disagreement in healthier ways? And so, in other words, in language of Phoenix generation, what does dialogue across differences mean?
I chair a island-wide group, Samantha, for the Irish government called Compass Points. So the secret's in the title. Compass Points mean north, south, east, and west. Just 4 times a year. We just meet once a quarter. And I always begin those conversations with a quote from a New York Times journalist, probably one of the more conservative writers, mind you, of the New York Times, Bret Stephens, who says, in order to disagree well, we need to understand well. So I'm not saying to people in my space or people in the United States, you all need to agree politically, because that ain't ever going to happen in any country on planet Earth, as you and I know only too well. But understanding the other person is crucial. In other words, humanizing the other person. And I think of the brilliant Jewish theologian, Jonathan Sachs, who I met him actually a few years ago in London, sadly died just a few years ago also of cancer. Jonathan Sachs uses this phrase, linguistic violence. So in other words, Samantha, the violence of the tongue. Another Jewish theologian, Abraham Joshua Herschel, actually marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement in the 60s, said it was words, not machines, that created Auschwitz. So long before the death camps, long before Cyclone B, there was a language prevalent in the 30s in Nazi Germany that demonized another race of people. In our space, did we demonize one another? We did. Dehumanization precedes genocide. So because of that demonization, it was much easier, sadly, to kill one another. And so I say to both Republican colleagues and Democrat colleagues, disagree by all means. That is what politics is about. But if you're dehumanizing a person, you're opening up a mechanism that that person isn't a human being. And obviously, from a background of Christian faith, all people, no matter why we agree, like them or disagree, every person on planet Earth has God's imprint on their head. And particularly people of faith need to remember that concept.
Yeah. That was a heavy answer.
Okay. That's your next PhD thesis. That's when you're older.
So you mentioned interfaith and identity politics, religion being often at the forefront of this conflict. As both a minister and a psychologist, how does faith inform your peacebuilding work, especially in spaces where religion itself can be a source of division?
I often say unashamedly, sometimes the highest priority for the church globally should be repentance. Because the church has got a hell of a lot wrong. Again, I mean, going back to Jonathan Sacks, who I've read extensively, and he says quite categorically there, Samantha, on one point, and it is a substantial one, the critics of religion are right. I mean, religion has done harm. It has led to crusades, jihads, inquisitions, and pogroms. It has shed the blood of human sacrifice in the name of high ideals. And you and I know, even as a younger person, people have hated in the name of the God of love, practiced cruelty in the name of the God of compassion, waged war in the name of the God of peace, and killed in the name of the God of life. I mean, those are undeniable facts, and they're absolutely terrifying. Interestingly, the great divines of another generation knew this. Blaise Pascal once said, men, primarily it is men who do the killing, let's be honest about that as my gender, men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from a religious conviction. C.S. Lewis, a Christian apologist of another generation, Chronicles of Narnia. I'm still playing a little bit of squash even at my age, but my squash club in Belfast is facing C.S. Lewis's boyhood home. And C.S. Lewis actually said, when Christianity does not make a man very much better, invariably it makes him very much worse. And I think that's the story of humanity. I mean, going back again to the Shoah or the Holocaust, I mean, Hitler wrote in the second chapter of Mein Kampf, today I believe I'm acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator and defending myself against the Jews. Now, Hitler was no observant Catholic or card-carrying evangelical. But Hitler was clever enough, as many political leaders are, to use religion as a means to holding on to political power. Another classic example of that is Ukraine at the moment. And people look at Ukraine and see a military-oriented conflict, which it is. People miss actually, Samantha, the religious dimension of Ukraine. And to explain that to you, I need to tell you about another Vladimir, not Vladimir Putin, but Vladimir the Rus, who in 1000 AD was converted to Christianity, mass baptism in the Dnieper River, and there and then the Russian Orthodox Church was born. And people are asking, why does Vladimir Putin want Kiev so much? That was where the Russian Orthodox Church was born, not Moscow and not St. Petersburg. And I think it's appalling that an archbishop in Russia recently said Vladimir Putin is a miracle from God, a religious leader, a person who's been guilty of rape, land repossession, stealing of children. And that is how religion can get so toxified and so messy, this kind of God is on my side mentality. And that's the history, sadly, of humanity. I saw it in our space as well. We produced a document in 1985 called For God and His Glory Alone. Not for God in Ireland or Britain or France or wherever, for God and God's glory alone. Because those things are eternal. And I often remind your listeners and remind us too today as well, politics is temporal. The gospel is eternal. And we need to really hold on to that.
So, thank you. Dialing back to what you mentioned previously, you worked with ex-loyal, like paramilitary loyalists, correct, in Northern Ireland?
Yeah.
And you mentioned empathy and understanding. When you were working in these spaces in Northern Ireland, working with ex-combatants, how did you, in the name of conflict transformation, get each side to come together like how you do in Israel and Palestine? How do you humanize each other?
I would have seen many men, sadly, Samantha of my generation, take up the gun. Do I condemn? There's so many phrases for this now. Was it terrorism? Was it political violence? Were they freedom fighters? Were they paramilitaries? The technical academic phrase now is non-state actors. That's the kind of sort of blurs a lot of what happened there. I suppose I had to ask myself the question, and thankfully I didn't, but I did have to ask myself the question, what possessed many young men of my generation to become killers? And as a colleague of mine once said, in the late 1960s, someone did not fly over Northern Ireland, spray us all with lunatic gas, and we all woke up one morning and said, let's start killing each other. There was a history of what I would define as toxic politics and toxic religion in that space literally for centuries. A demonization, a hatred of the other person. And moving these people off the stage, to use our phraseology, was not an overnight phenomenon. So sometimes the Western mind, as you and I know, living in the United States and me living in Western Europe, we want everything done instantaneously. No one has any patience. These negotiations literally, Samantha, took years. But it was important that voices were speaking into those rooms. I mean, I was the youngest person in the late 1980s with older people, much more experienced than me, but I was asked to be part of the conversation, trying to give these people what I call moral alternatives. And as a young person, a few years older than you, late 20s, I came to the conclusion quite quickly. If you lock 40 men in a room listening to their own reassuring voices, it's a recipe for disaster. So we had to create alternatives, namely political alternatives, that their ultimate goals could be achieved through politics, not through the barrel of the gun. But it was not an overnight phenomenon. There were setbacks. And one of the other keys as well, Samantha, was these talks were private. And so if you know anything about negotiation, as many of your listeners no doubt do, when do you make the private public? And that was a very, very delicate dance, knowing that when you went public, you had to make sure there was a critical mass of people who were prepared to move into a peace process. In the early 90s, look, we had what was called a mutually hurting stalemate. No one was going to win. The IRA were never going to defeat the British Army. The British Army were not going to defeat the IRA, could have contained them forever. And the loyalist groupings were not going to defeat the IRA. So leadership emerged in both communities to begin to move us into a peace process. Ceasefires 1994, Good Friday Agreement 1998. That was a 10-year span just to get the agreement.
Oh, that's a really long time.
Yeah, it was.
Conflict transformation, as you mentioned earlier, is different from resolution. It's different from peacekeeping. It's a long-term effort because you want to be able to sustain it.
Yeah.
So it makes sense why these peace agreements and these settlements take so long. It is a bit frustrating, and I can't imagine living through that space and all that time.
And really, if you look at the Middle East there today, Samantha, I mean, I guess if we were having this conversation, the two of us in the early 1990s, I know you weren't born then, but the three big conflicts were South Africa, Northern Ireland, and Israel and Palestine. South Africa were over the line as regards apartheid. Most observers were assuming that with the Oslo Accords, Israelis and Palestinians were over the line, and the Irish one was seen as the big intractable conflict. Here we are 30 years later, and I don't need to remind your listeners that the big intractable conflict today, as you and I know only too well, is the Israeli-Palestinian theatre. I've had 1,200 Israelis and Palestinians with me in Belfast and Dublin in the last 15 years. And when I say Israelis, Palestinians, I mean of every shade of opinion. I'm talking those on the hard right, those who are centrists, those who are on the left. Because you just can't build a peace process around one simple constituency. You really have to get a critical mass. And interestingly, Samantha, we always do a debrief at the end. Not me telling them what they learned, but they saying, Gary, there are 5 lessons. And all the groups invariably say this. They would say political leadership in your space was essential to achieving peace. In other words, politicians took risks, faced down detractors in their own community. The futility of violence. We had enough weaponry there, and that was the second one. We had enough weaponry in the island of Ireland, Samantha, to kill each other for another 50 years. But we realized, we kill one of you, you kill one of us. So leaders began to realize we need to get some alternative to the futility of violence. Third one is every Israeli and Palestinian says to me, Gary, you don't understand. And I know what they're going to say. What do I not understand? We don't trust each other. And I say, do you think as a very, very young clergy person, the first time we went into these rooms, we were like hugging and kissing each other, like popping bottles of champagne. People in the room hated each other. But I say, you cannot keep using the prerequisite of trust as an excuse for not beginning the conversation. Why, Samantha? Trust only comes, as you and I know, in the context of a meaningful relationship. So our goal was to establish relationships between warring parties to allow trust to actually evolve. The security issue always comes up because both Palestinians and Israelis want to feel secure. We only got real security when we dealt with the root causes of the conflict. The final one we've already alluded to, the role of civic society in peace building, which was crucial in our space.
That 5-step process, that's important. And as you mentioned, that can be kind of applicated to other conflicts. Yeah. And for any two warring or arguing groups, I feel like the lessons that you learn in Northern Ireland, often so seen in conflict transformation, serves as such a good template. And I use the term good. Obviously, nothing good came out of it, but it serves as a transferable template. So that's very interesting to know, to see how those lessons can be applied to the Middle East, given such different geographic locations. Phoenix Generation, our organization, our student-led movement, is rooted in the idea of rising from conflict rather than avoiding it. All so similar with rethinking conflict. What does that look like in practice for young leaders who want change but feel burnt out or disillusioned?
Again, I'll illustrate this with a story. I mean, a couple of years ago was the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in 2023. A colleague of mine, Brian Rowan, who was the BBC security correspondent during the conflict, I mean, we're good friends, and he was doing a thing called 25 pieces from 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement. And one of those pieces, I mean, there are many pieces. I mean, his attic is full of different bits and pieces from the conflict, obviously as a journalist and a security correspondent. But as a throwaway comment with my emerging young leaders, he said, if you think the last 25 years was important, the next 25 years will be even more important. The reason being, many of my generation will no longer be on planet Earth. So if leaders in the United States are not passing their skill base down to your generation, they are making a grave mistake. I often look back to the Good Friday Agreement, and many people from your space, President George Bush, Bill Clinton, Bertie Ahern, who was the Irish Prime Minister, Tony Blair. I mean, Bertie Ahern, Clinton, and Tony Blair were in their 40s and 50s. They were not young, but they were of a middle-aged generation and had the energy to move that forward. And I think for many people, maybe of my generation, people in their 50s and 60s, listening in on this, ask yourself the question that my British official asked me in 2019. Gary, what are you doing for the next generation? Because there's something to be said, I think, and I think particularly in a spiritual context, there's something about giving yourself away and not being selfish and thinking of yourself. So you think of the legacy of many folk listening to this, if it could be passing your skill base to the next generation, knowing when you're retired or maybe medically incapacitated, the work you believe in, the passion you have is being carried on to another generation. I mean, that is absolutely crucial. Because I look at the change in our space when I was a kind of young kid there in the 70s. I mean, dating someone from the other tradition was a risky business. Where my grandfather's buried, Samantha, 2 graves, and my grandfather is the grave of 2 Protestant boys who were dating 2 Catholic girls. They were shot dead for falling in love with another human being from the other political tradition. And that happens all over the planet. as you know and your listeners know only too well. Now today, to introduce a bit of romance for your listeners, we all like romance. Today, dating across the political divide is 20 to 25%. So that's a change over 30 years. So your generation are growing up in a very, very different space. So I think for all of us, how do we empower, scale up a younger generation? And I also say this, people of my generation have access to people that your generation don't. So I often make sure key leaders, key change makers are in the room with your generation. So I should be ensuring, I don't want to spend an evening with those people. I spent my life working with them. Your generation should be spending evenings and weekends with these people and learning their skill base. So really, people listening to this of my generation should not be gatekeepers. And what I mean by gatekeepers, that you control who gets in and out of the gate. You should be opening as a leader in Central Florida, the gate as wide as possible to these young people that Samantha is involved in, and Samantha is talking about to scale up a new generation to make a difference.
Honestly, that is just so refreshing to hear. You don't really hear that much, especially from people from your generation speaking, and you speak with such conviction about passing the torch and intentional mentorship. And I think we could all benefit from that.
I'll tell you a final story that'll make you smile. So when I started the Emerging Young Leaders, fine, but I twinned them with the Israeli Palestinians. And the first meeting obviously took place by Zoom before the delegation from the Middle East came to us. So let me get my time zones right, because I'm sitting in Central Florida. So the meeting began at 5 p.m. Belfast time to 7 p.m. 7 p.m. Jerusalem time to 9 p.m. Jerusalem time. Lasting allegedly 2 hours. So I did a little lecture, we did breakout rooms, etc., etc., etc. It was all finished by 7 p.m. Belfast time. So I left my study, come downstairs, went into my front room, and I was reading Samantha, and I got a text at 9:30 from one of my emerging leaders called Jakey. He says, "That was great, Gary. We're just finished." I text him back, "What do you mean you're just finished?" "Oh, after that all finished, your bit, we stayed in the room as young leaders from different traditions and chatted to one another." Now you think that was 9:30 p.m. my time in Belfast. That was 11:30 p.m. in Jerusalem. Which taught me a lesson. You don't need to be in the room, Gary Mason. Empower those younger people. You get out of the room and let them work it out. It's just a very, very simple, but a very profound lesson for someone of my generation. My fingerprints do not need to be over this. My fingerprints should be off this, but creating a context for your generation to ensure that you are the skilled leaders of the next generation.
That just warms my heart. I mean, the work that we're doing here in Central Florida with the Phoenix generation, it's all about youth-led movement. Yeah. And to see that same thing is happening in Jerusalem, in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it's just a shift that people want so desperately. And thank you for sharing all those stories.
Thank you. Great to be with you in this beautiful weather. My kids are texting me saying, "Dad, you're so lucky. It's so miserable and wet here at the moment." So it's great to be with you. And I wish you well, Samantha, and your colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Mason. Well, thank you for being here. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. I hope you learned a couple of new things today. And until next time, bye.